So, as we study this, and we look at these Gentiles and the Jews' attitude towards them, I mean, they have nothing to do with it. Huge prejudice. But when you go back and look in the Old Testament, God never told them to do that. God just said stay separate. And that was from a breeding, sounds harsh, from a breeding perspective. They weren't supposed to intermarry. Why? Because every time they did, they ended up being influenced by the false gods of who they married into, right? We see it again and again and again throughout Scripture. I mean, so what brought Solomon down was intermarrying with non-Jewish women. And so what happens is they took that command to stay separate, and then they built it into this whole thing of they're filthy dogs, unclean, we don't have anything to do with them, you don't look at them, you don't acknowledge them, certainly don't touch them, never would you go into their house. Never would you allow them into your house, and not by any means at all. And, think about how upset the Pharisees were when Jesus went to have meals with the Jewish tax collectors, right? Imagine going in to have with Gentiles. That's where we are. So Peter, 7 years walking with the Holy Spirit. You know what? He's full of prejudice. We're going to see that today. Still full of prejudice. So God's going to have to do something miraculous to really mold his heart. And so that's where we're going to be today. And so if you got the timeline, you'll see up here where Cornelius is in chapter 10:1. And remember, Paul's on the sidelines. Paul after 3 years in Arabia, messed up his ministry. All he did was irritate people. And so God used the apostles to take him and put him back to Tarsus, where he was for 7 to 10 years on the sideline. Or I like to look at it like he was in the minor leagues. He wasn't ready to play. He wasn't ready for prime time yet. They sent him back to the minor leagues to work on his game. So that then now, about 7 to 10 years later, and it's interesting, God's going to use Barnabas to bring Paul into ministry, back into ministry, and then bring him to Jerusalem for the Jerusalem Council to straighten out theology that Peter's got wrong. So we see that these things happen, and I believe, and this is just my opinion, I believe the reason that we see this and the timelines and why it takes so long is that even though they were apostles, which were completely separate from anybody else, but they're apostles, they're still men. And they're still subject to their own flesh. Because you know what? Flesh is where prejudice and hang-ups come from. Amen. That's where that comes from. So we see that it took Peter, it's going to take Peter 7 or 8 years before he finally deals with this. So that's what our text is all about. And instead of reading all the text, we're just going to walk through the text kind of verse by verse or section by section and see what it is. So, in fact, in chapters 10 and 11 is really cool because it really, even though I said like the Ethiopian eunuch, and certainly there were some other individual Gentiles that had gotten saved, but this is the first time when the message of salvation goes wholesale to a huge group of Gentiles. So this is really when the Gentiles come into the fold, per se. So, the first, like I said, after these first 8 years, so it's in a pronounced way, what we're going to see is God has to prepare Peter's heart in order to take the message to the Gentiles. Because he's got a hang-up. He's got a hang-up against Gentiles. Now, what we see is, we saw last week, remember with Simon the Tanner. Simon the Tanner would have been a Jew. He'd been considered unclean because he dealt with dead animals, but yet Peter went to stay with him, which means Peter's starting to kind of get past, because remember, the idea that a tanner was unclean isn't in the law, the Mosaic law, it's in the rabbinical law. In other words, it's extra stuff they've added up. Remember, the Pharisees, over the 700 years or so, had created hundreds and hundreds of additional laws or rules that were outside the Mosaic law, what's written in Scripture. They kept adding things to it, and that was one of the things they added to it. So clearly, Peter has already changed somewhat, because he's looking going, you know what? This is my view. I think you look at it and say, Peter's like, yeah, Tanner is unclean because you say he's unclean, but there's nothing in the Bible. There's nothing in the Bible that says he's unclean. There's nothing in the Old Testament that says unclean. So therefore, I'm going to change with that. So God had to do this supernatural thing with him. And it's interesting because we're going to read about this man Cornelius, who was a Roman centurion, and he was called a God-fearer, and we'll talk about what that means. Because you got God-fearers versus proselytes. TDS, I think that's right. Okay, and we'll talk. And what these are Jewish converts. Okay. So a Gentile could become a Jewish proselyte. In other words, they would come and they would acknowledge, right, Judaism, and they would want to become Jews. And so two things had to happen. If they were males, they had to be circumcised, and then secondly, they had to be baptized, for lack of a better word, but it was a ritualistic cleaning. Remember John the Baptist? What was he doing in the Jordan River? He was baptized, but he wasn't baptizing like we baptize. It was a ritualistic baptism. So if you go back and you study the Old Testament, when you're unclean, you go through a ritualistic of cleansing. And this, what John was saying was, confess your sins, become new again. And that's what a proselyte would have to do. And once they did that, they would be considered Jews. Now, technically, they were considered a lower caste Jew, but they were still Jews. A God-fearer was still a Gentile. And we'll talk about what that means and what a God-fearer is as we study. And we'll see why. Well, you'll understand why Cornelius is called a God-fearer. So, what do we know about him? God is doing His work in Cornelius. So God's going to use an unsaved man, Cornelius, Gentile, and He's going to use Peter to bring them together. So it's cool because He's going to use a Gentile, unsaved Gentile, and we'll talk about why he's unsaved, why we believe he's unsaved, how he gets saved. And He's going to use that person to change the heart of His kind of number one guy in ministry. Here it is. So what we want to do is we want to look at that and say, God can use anything, even an unbeliever, to shape our faith. And we know that because of Isaiah 55, 8 and 9 says, my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. As for the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. So see, we have a pre-programmed concept of how this is how things ought to be done. God doesn't have pre-programmed concepts. He'll do whatever is necessary, especially to save one who is coming after, who's seeking for Him, which is what we're going to see with Cornelius. So what was Cornelius? Verse 1. Now there was a certain man in Caesarea named Cornelius, a centurion, who was also in what is called the Italian cohort. Now, cohort equals battalion. It's a military term. It's a battalion. So, Caesarea is a city on the Mediterranean. Don't get it confused with Caesarea Philippi, which is endless. It's on the Mediterranean. And there was Herod the Great built a huge complex there and named it Caesarea, is named after Caesar Augustus, is who it was. Now, this man was, Cornelius was a centurion. So let's understand what a centurion is. So there was a big military outpost. The governor lived there, the military outpost there in Caesarea on that. So the Roman army was divided into legions. A legion is 6,000 men. And they were divided into cohorts or bands or battalions. And a battalion equaled 600 men. Okay? So you had 10 battalions. You had 10 battalions and a legion. That's 6,000 to 600. And then what do you have? And so then they would break the 600 down into 100 men. And so what's 100 equals century? Therefore, centurion. So he was a centurion. So what that means is that he was in charge of 100 fighting men. So he was a captain in charge of that. They were the backbone of the Roman army. And what's interesting, it says he was from the Italian cohort. And that was, the Italian cohort was men that were Italian born. They were Italians. They weren't born in another area, right? And they were considered elite troops. So he's an elite troop who's Italian, which means probably, I don't know this for a fact, but probably in that position, he would have spoken multiple languages because he would have been able to deal with, because he's posted here in Israel, so he probably spoke Aramaic and Greek, so multiple things. And so he was a career soldier. But what's interesting, now look at his orientation. Go to verse 2. But he was also, so remember, so again my point is, if he's a centurion, he's Roman through and through. He's tough. He leads 100 fighting men. That's what he is. He's a fighter. But look at his heart, okay? Because that's his job. But look at his heart. It says he was a devout man, one who feared God with all his household and gave many alms to the Jewish people and prayed to God continuously. Wow. So, what we see about that is that he's called a God-fearer, which is somebody who believed, because remember, Romans were polytheists, right? They believed in multiple gods. Jews were monotheists. They believed in one God. And so typically what you would find in a God-fearer, somebody would start as a God-fearer, then become a proselyte. Because what they would do is they would say they believed in the single God concept, right? They believed in the moral law of the Jews. They thought it was good. They saw how things were organized within the moral law, and they thought, well, this is good for me. He just never went through the conversion to Judaism. Again, it would have required him to be ceremonially baptized and circumcised. And so all we know is that he feared God. So he was a God-fearer. He believed in a single God. He understood, which that's why we believe that he probably spoke multiple languages, Aramaic, Hebrew. He understood the Scriptures, potentially, and he thought they were correct. And so because here's what he's doing. He's giving money because he thinks it's good, and he prays to God every day. Interesting, right? So Gentile converts, as we said, were no longer considered Gentiles. The proselytes are considered Jews, but God-fearers are still considered Gentiles. And that's important to understand, because what's going to happen is God's going to change Peter's heart. He's actually going to go in this guy's house, which he would have never, ever done. So he was an admirable person, right? We would look around and say, like people that you know that are not believers, say, but you know what? They're really good people. They got good hearts. They love people. They do good. Right? That's what we would have said about Cornelius if he had been around us. He was a good guy, right? But we have to remember, he was not saved. He's not a regenerate man. He's unsaved. And he was just a God-fearing man that was good by human standards. So, now look what happens now in verses 3 through 6. Suddenly, he prays every day. And if you notice, he prays at the time of the day that the Jews praise. That's why you say, well, Raymond, how do you know he studied the Old Testament? Because he's praying at the right time. That means he's studying something. He's doing it. So look what it says, 3 through 6. And about the 9th hour of the day, he clearly saw a vision of an angel who had just come into him and said, Cornelius. And fixing his gaze upon him, and being much alarmed, he said, what is it, Lord? By the way, the word Lord there means sir, if you want to write that down. He's not saying Lord like God. It's a reference to sir. In other words, it's an acknowledgement, this is somebody special. And he said to him, your prayers and alms have ascended as a memorial before God, and now dispatch some men to Joppa, and send them for a man named Simon, who is also called Peter, and he is staying with a certain tanner named Simon, whose house is by the sea. Remember, we ended up last week, the very last verse of chapter 9, where was Peter? Staying with Simon the tanner. And so, you see, I want you, don't miss God's sovereignty. We're going to see it weave together here. So he sends him to this tanner. He stays there, right? Because Peter has figured out this guy's not really unclean. And now what they're going to do, he says, this is where Peter is. So God sends an angel to an unbeliever and says, send some men to Joppa, get Simon Peter, bring him to your place. So that's where we are. So now dispatch him into Joppa, send him there, and find him. So Cornelius was praying at the regular 3 o'clock afternoon prayer time. So again, that's where I glean that he knew the Scriptures, and he was a God-fearer. He understood. He just had never converted to Judaism for whatever reason, right? But what I don't want you to do is don't look at that and say, okay, well, God looked down and said, oh, Cornelius, you're a pretty good guy. I think, therefore, I'll save you. It wasn't anything like that. It's because Isaiah 53 says, we have all gone astray, we have all turned, everyone is in his own way. So it wasn't works. God didn't look down and say, boy, you're a really spectacular guy, I think I'll save you. Notice God didn't use the angel. Now, isn't it interesting? Why couldn't the angel tell him about salvation? I mean, if the angel's going to show up during your prayer time, why didn't the angel just say, hey, this is what you need to do to be saved? You know what?
Leave it to Peter.
You're going to leave it to Peter. Why? Throughout the New Testament, you will never see an angel telling someone the message of salvation. They're messengers. God ordained men, women, that means men and women, to proclaim the gospel to other people, not angels. If he was going to use angels, why would he save us and then give us a commission? Think about it. Just think the logic of that. I mean, he's got lots of angels, I think. Right? Well, why couldn't he just send everybody an angel in a vision when they're praying? Right? Because he asked us to do it. Actually, he didn't ask us. He told us. Difference here. He told us to do it. That's the Great Commission here. That's the Great Commission of 1:8. I mean, it's repeated. So when we look at this, God sent the angel to Cornelius, but does what? Says, hey, I want you to go see this man and get him and let him come to you. So therefore, it's a humbling and high responsibility when we think about that God could send angels to tell people about himself, and it would be supernatural, but instead he uses us. Why? Because our salvation is supernatural. We looked at that last week. It's the greatest, it's better than any miracle. If God could heal somebody, which he does, and he heals them, that's great. They're still going to die. So isn't it a bigger miracle if he heals our heart and we never die? That's the whole concept that we're trying to understand here. So now look at Cornelius. What's Cornelius do? It's interesting. He gets this vision and he obeys. He submits. He does what God tells him to do. Look, 7 and 8. It says, when the angel was speaking to him, when the angel that was speaking to him had departed, he summoned 2 of his servants and a devout soldier of those who were in attendance upon him. And after he explained everything to them, he sent them to Joppa. He said, look, man, I saw an angel. Angel stood and told me, go find this man Peter. He's staying at Simon the tanner's house over in Caesarea. So boom, 3 of them take off and to go find them. So interesting, at the same time, God is beginning to prepare Peter's heart. And he's going to do it through a vision. So God is going to help Peter. So God looks down at Peter, and what do we know about God? Does God look at the outside? Nope, looks at the inside. And he looks at Peter and he says, Peter, you got a problem. You got a problem. You're hung up on traditions, hang-ups, and prejudices of Judaism. All right? So, he's got to change Peter's heart. How he's going to do it? Well, let's look. So, look at the conditions for this vision. Peter gets a vision in verses 9 and 10. Or 9 through 16. And then here's the condition. It says, the next day, they were on their way. This is the men coming. They were approaching the city. So here's the 3 guys. Cornelius has sent them. They're coming to the city. Same time, Peter goes up to the rooftop of the 6th hour to pray. See, again, he's doing like he's supposed to do, what tradition calls for. Right? He gets hungry and desiring to eat, and they were making preparations to eat, and he fell into a trance. Right here, the providence of God is at work. Because what's happening? So you got Cornelius' men. They're over here in Caesarea. All right? And they're traveling right here to Joppa. Okay? God's already, we'll say, well, how do we do it? So we'll look. So God's already showed up here. And God's fixing to show up here so that they'll come out and meet. And his vision will come together for them. Right? It teaches us that God is always working things, right, according to the counsel of his own will. Always. So he's ordaining this thing to come together, and he's going to use this Gentile, unregenerate man to show Peter a great lesson and mature him in his faith. He's roughing off the edges of Peter when he does this. So look at what the vision says. And behold, the sky opened up, and a certain object like a great sheet coming down, lowered on 4 corners to the ground. And on it were all kinds of 4-footed animals and crawling creatures of the earth and birds of the air. Peter's hungry. You ever get that hungry? Right? When you're hungry, it might be you just... You're waiting, man. Whatever gets set in front of you is getting devoured. Boom. And so now all of a sudden he sees this vision come down, and there's every animal and crawling thing. And the sheet contained, which is interesting, so the sheet contained every animal, all animals, which means there would be clean and unclean animals, right? Cows are clean, pigs are unclean. Crawling things, all crawling things, according to the Mosaic law, are unclean. And so what does the angel then turn around and say to Peter? Voice came to him and said, arise, Peter, kill and eat. Or smorgasbord, you know? It's like going to Denny's, right? Or wherever that dead is, right? So here's Peter's issue. Now watch this. His culture and his background now is going to rear its head. Because God didn't say, hey, eat anything that's clean. He says, eat anything that's there. Now, God was not only telling Peter that the Jewish dietary laws have been done away with since Christ had come, but it was also a much bigger symbolic truth that Gentiles were no longer unclean. This is the key word for the whole text. Unclean. Clean versus unclean. So he's going to use a real example, because Peter knows the difference between clean and unclean, and he clearly can't eat unclean things. Right? So what do we see Peter already struggling with? Now, 8 years after salvation, he's struggling with the fact that he's no longer under the law. Now, y'all realize we're not under the law anymore. We're under grace. The law is a mirror for us because the law shows us our sin. But we're not underneath it. Now, it doesn't mean that, then therefore, you know what? I can lie and cheat and steal and do all the things that I want to do because I'm not under the law. You know, Paul addressed that. He said, yeah, so you're going to sin more so that grace can abound more? No way. It doesn't work that way. Right? And that would show an unregenerate man at that. So God uses an example Peter would clearly understand. So what is Peter? And it's interesting because look at what Peter says in verse 14. This is awesome. He says, by no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything unholy or unclean. Look at me. Look at me. How many times did we hear in the Gospels, did we hear Jesus address people like that? Right, the rich young ruler. What must I do? Oh, I keep the law perfectly, always have. He says, give up everything and follow me. Right? Pride, I. See the Pharisee in the temple, right? Looks over at the tax collector. The tax collector's pouring his heart out to the Lord. What's he say? Thank goodness I'm not like that Cretan. Wow. Everything points back to I. And the same thing here, Peter. Look, man, he's got some growing to do. You would think, day one, he got the Holy Spirit, he knows everything, right? No, he's still got traditions, hang-ups, and prejudices, right? Even though God told him 3 times, eat. And he says, I can't do that. So here is a true Christian, even an apostle, and he's so hung up. And so what do hang-ups do? Just as a side note, what do hang-ups do?
Stop growth.
There you go. They kill growth and messaging. And I say messaging as in telling people about Jesus. Because guess what? What that means is, my hang-up is, I'm going to decide who ought to be saved. That's a Jonah complex. Right? Remember why Jonah ran? He didn't think the Ninevites were worthy of God's love. That's what prejudice is when we look at that. So God was not only telling Peter that these laws were no good, he was saying, wait a minute, I want you to take that and apply it. It's interesting because, and I say this a lot, Baptists get a bad name, but we've created it. Why? About rules. You ask a generalized person out on the street who's a non-believer about Christianity. They say, well, what about Baptists? Oh,
Brimstone.
Yeah. Well, it's not necessarily the hellfire and brimstone. It's known by our rules. We're known by our rules, not our love. It should be the opposite. We should be known by our love. It's interesting. So when we look at that concept, Ray Stedman, who was a pastor who's gone home to be with the Lord, he wrote this about that, and I really thought this was good because what Peter's doing there, he's saying, I have never eaten anything unholy. In other words, I want you to know, this is how righteous I am. I've never done any of those things. That's what Ray Stedman said about this. One thing I forgot to print in big enough font. The world is not impressed by the fact that we Christians do not do certain things. We say, I don't dance, I don't drink, I don't smoke, I don't chew, and I don't go out with girls that do. And we expect the world to be impressed. Well, they're not impressed. There are many then who will not entertain certain things for reasons other than religion. There's no merit to it. If all we can say is that we don't do certain things, then we have nothing at all to interest a non-Christian. Think about it. Why do I want to come be part of you? What, so I can say, oh, I don't do this anymore, and I don't do that anymore? Then we're rules-based. We're not grace-based. We're not love-based. We're not faith-based. I mean, do you really think it's attractive to people to say, oh, let me go with the people that have all the rules versus the people that have all the love and joy and peace and patience and all the, what would attract somebody? The fruit of the Spirit or a set of rules that they think they're supposed to carry out? I think it would be the fruit of the Spirit. And hopefully we see that here. And again, 15 and 16, he repeats the command. He said a second time, what God has cleansed, no longer consider unholy. That's what he's saying. What God has cleansed. And it happened 3 times. Immediately the object was taken up to the sky. Do you hear what he's saying? He says what God has cleansed, do no longer consider it unholy or unclean. Unholy. And unholy is different than unclean. So what would unholy mean? Okay? So unclean is not worthy. not saved. Difference. Can an unholy person be saved? Sure, absolutely they can. We were all unholy at one time, weren't we? Okay? Unclean is different. Unclean says you're not worthy. So what is unclean? It's hang up and it's prejudice. That's the difference. Unholy is separate. So look at God's words here really, really closely. It says eat anything on there. And there were clean and unclean things on there from Peter's perspective, right? But what God said was there's nothing on that sheet that's not unclean. It's all unholy. So that's why when you look at verse 16 it says what God has cleansed no longer consider unholy. So what's God going to cleanse? Gentiles. So Gentiles are unholy, but at salvation, plus salvation, equals holy. So in other words, at salvation, they're saved, they're set apart. They've been set apart as one of God's children. Do you see the difference? That's what we're talking about here. So Peter evidently was a slow learner, I guess, but look at his confusion in 17 and 18. Now, while Peter was greatly perplexed in his mind as to what the vision which he had seen might be, behold, the men who had been sent by Cornelius, having asked direction for Simon's house, appeared at the gate, and calling out, they were asking whether Simon, who is called Peter, was staying there. So as soon as he gets this vision, he's trying to figure it out. 3 times God says, right, what God has cleansed, no longer concede unholy, and then boom, here comes 3 Gentiles to the gate. Uh-oh, decision time. What do I do? Do I run out the back door? Or do I hear it? And look what happens. And look at how God's beginning to shape his heart. Verses 19 through 22. Watch this. And while Peter was reflecting on the vision, the Spirit said to him, behold, 3 men are looking for you. But arise, go downstairs, and accompany them without misgivings, without doubts. For I have sent them myself. And Peter went down to the men and said, behold, I am the one you are looking for. What is the reason for which you have come? And normally he would not even talk to a Gentile. I mean, that's the premise. And they said, Cornelius, a centurion, a righteous man, and a God-fearing man, well spoken of by the entire nation of the Jews, was divinely directed by a holy angel to send for you to come to his house and hear a message from you. Wow. Isn't that cool? He gets the vision. Hey, there's a guy named Peter here. Comes down, Gentiles. And I can see Peter, because remember, he's on the roof. And this is my vision of him, right? I read in color, man. He goes, looks on the roof. Sees a Roman soldier and 2 other Gentiles. And so he's like, decision time. Do I go out the back steps? Or do I follow? Look what he did. While Peter was reflecting on the vision, so he's thinking about, what in the world does this unclean, not be unclean? God wants me to eat unclean things. He wants me to associate with unclean things. I don't understand. The Spirit said to him, behold, 3 men are coming. So what was he doing? He was doing just like Habakkuk did. He was just wrestling with God. There's nothing wrong with wrestling with God. I don't understand. I don't think this is, here it is. And the Spirit said to him, and I think that's so cool, because remember, the angel came with the vision and brought the sheet down. Now the Spirit is talking to him. Guess what? That's no different than the Spirit talking to you and me. Go, right? But if we're not in tune, he was clearly in tune, because he just had a vision, right? So his antennas are up. Right? But that's no different than you or I if we're not in tune to when God says, that guy over there needs to hear about me. Oh, and then what do? That's the Spirit. So what would we do in that thing? But arise and go downstairs and meet him. And Peter went down and he said, I'm the one you're looking for. What's up, bud? And they said, well, look, this guy Cornelius, he's a centurion, but you know what? He fears God. He loves God, and which is the same kind of thing. And he got a vision from an angel and said, you got a message for us. Well, did he have a message? Not then. But God was going to give him one. That's what's so good. We got to see the sovereignty of God. He's working through this. And I was thinking about a great example of watching the sovereignty of God work with 2 different people. Right? So 5.5 years ago, Pastor Darrell had retired. We didn't have a pastor. And so we were using Glenn Rogers, and he was helping us fill the pulpit, right? I taught some, and then we had others. And so he had, at the time, Glenn says, well, I got 3 guys that are doing pulpit supply. they'll rotate to a church when they need a pastor who's out of our association, 50 plus churches. And so one of those names, so he emailed the list to Keith Stevens and I. One of the names on the list was this guy named Conrad Westbrook. And what had happened was Conrad was associate pastor at a church in Indiana. And then God had called on him to leave that and come down and be a missionary for FCA in West Volusia County. So they moved from Indiana, following God's call, and moved to West Volusia County, moved to where they live now, Orange City, and he worked for Fellowship of Christian Athletes throughout Volusia County, and at Stetson University, working with them, he met Glenn Rogers. And they hit it off, they got along real well, so Glenn said, hey, what do you preach? He said, yeah, I can preach, and so, I need pulpit supply. Because you have to remember, most of the churches in the association only have one pastor. They don't have an associate. And so if the pastor's out on vacation or sick, we got to fill the spot. So Conrad's jumping all around. So we split up the list, and I called one guy, and Keith called Conrad and said, hey, would you be interested potentially in coming, and we need somebody to fill in, an interim pastor. You don't have to do anything but show up on Sunday mornings and preach. And he said, not interested. Okay. He said, I'm busy. I got my, because I'm doing pulpit supply other places, and I got my own church that our family wants to go to. That's cool. So here we are. So we're praying. Right? That God's going to, we got a team together, we're praying that God's going to bring us a pastor at some point. So progress along, about 6 months later, 7 months later, somebody was coming to preach, and then they couldn't, and conflict came up, and so he said, well, I'll call that Conrad guy back again, see possibly because he didn't want to come be our full-time, maybe he'd just show up, the third Sunday from now. Called him and he said, sure, schedule's open, I'll show up. And he showed up on a Sunday morning. Walked over and met him. He was sitting there with Gina and Jordan and Jesse, and he had a coat and tie on. And he was there to preach. And he stood up and he preached. And he sat down. And the service was over, and Lisa Albert, who was our church secretary at the time, while I was standing there talking to him, she walked up and looked Conrad right in that face. If you knew Lisa, she was pretty blunt. And said, can we keep you? Literally, can we keep you? 2 weeks later, Conrad called me. He said, I think God's doing something in my life. I said, really, what's that? He said, I think I'd like to throw my name in the hat at your church. We had search committee. Yeah. You see that? God was using that. And he brought us together just like that. And he came here just to preach once. And God touched his heart and said, this is where I got for you. You see, that's the sovereignty of God. We were praying for this, for a guy, had no idea who he was going to be. And then, boom. In fact, if you went back, talked to Melinda Griffith and some of the others that were on that, Paula Pravat was on that search team with us, and we were really frustrated at that point. Because, we were seeing resumes come in, and we were in a lot of prayer. The church was in a lot of prayer over that. Nothing was sticking. And we were starting to get frustrated. Like, okay, God, are you ever going to give us a pastor? Right? And the sovereignty of God came in and it worked. Now look at what happened with the sovereignty of God. Look at what Peter did in verse 23. He said, and remember, these are Gentiles he's looking at. One of them's a Roman soldier. And what's he say? And he invited them in and gave them lodging. You see God changing a heart? That's God changing a heart. When a man comes to Christ, Christ makes him face his cultural, religious, and personal, right? Yes. And that's what God was doing in this particular situation. We're actually running over, which is highly unusual. So, now let's look at where the situation continues going. 23 through 27. Look what happened when Peter arrived. So Peter says, so he brings them in, they lodge overnight, because clearly it wasn't that far a walk from Caesarea there to Joppa. If you look on your maps, it's not. And so he brings them in and lodges them. So here are these Gentiles in with 2 Jewish converts, Peter and Simon the tanner, and he brings them in, and what does that mean? Likely, you have to read in color. If he brought them in the lodge overnight, then what did he do with them? He had a meal with them. They
had all that food.
Had all that food, yeah. So they had a meal with them. He's sitting with Gentiles in a Jewish house. So if you figure that he's roughly Jesus' age, then, he's late 30s. He never interacted with a Gentile in his entire life. But yet here he was. And so look what happened, verse 23 through 27. The next day he arose And he went away with them, and again, next day, so that implies they lodged overnight. So he spent the night with Gentiles. And can you imagine? I just vision Peter going, boy, Lord, I hope this is right, because I don't want John and those other guys to hear about this, right? The sons of thunder may come in and beat me up if they know what I'm doing. Right? Next day they arose, they went away, and he took some of the brethren from Joppa to go with him. So he took some other Jewish converts, Christians, with him. The following day he entered Caesarea. Now Cornelius was waiting for him, and he had called together his relatives and close friends. And then when it came about that Peter entered, Cornelius met him and fell at his feet and worshipped him. But Peter raised him up and saying, stand up, I too am just a man. And as he talked with them, he entered and found many people assembled. So Cornelius knows they're coming back. He's acting on the vision God gave him. And so he's got his relatives, which he'd already said that his relatives were God-fearers too. So he's got his family. He's brought his neighbors in. He said, look, God is bringing this person to us. And so it's interesting because God is in control of these circumstances. And look what happens. Now think about what's going on here. This centurion, remember, he's from the Italian cohort, which means he's super tough. And because he's special, right? He's got 100 tough men under he's been in war. He's a war fighter. And again, the Romans acknowledged the Jews, but they didn't, it wasn't like he was going to do it. What did he do? Think about the pride, or the lack of pride, the humility that Cornelius had. Here comes this Jewish fisherman into his house, and in front of all of his family and his friends, he bows down in front of him. That shows a humble heart. And God's seeking people with humble hearts. And so, of course, Peter, then think about Peter. Now, it's the same thing. Peter's got all this pride that God's trying to rough off of him, and he's got this Gentile Roman soldier bowing down in front. I mean, go watch Gladiator, man. It's that kind of stuff, right? Watch this guy bow down in front of him, and Peter says, hey, man, no, get up. I'm just a man. And I just imagine Peter's, this light bulb going on. He said, get up. I am just a man, no different than you. Boom, boom. Guess what? In his mind, and again, I read in color, man. I see the light bulb going off. He went, holy cow, Lord, you're right. I'm no different than him. He's unholy, which means he's unsaved, but he's not unclean. He learned what it meant. So what did Cornelius do? He opened his home. He was ready to go. Think of, the humility as Peter goes into this house. I just think it's really cool when you see what he does. And he says, what faith? Peter's there. Peter's now, again, you got to remember, he has never been in a Gentile's house in his life. And now he's walking into one. After he just lodged and had meals and spent the night with a few other of them. And so God is changing his heart right before our eyes. And so Peter explains the vision. He says, and he said to them, you yourselves know how unlawful, this is Peter talking to them. He says, you yourselves know how unlawful, because they knew Jewish tradition, for a man who is a Jew to associate with a foreigner or to visit him. And yet God has shown me that I should not call any man unholy or unclean. Can't do it. In other words, just a man. In other words, what he's figured out now is, Peter said, if God could save me, a wretched sinner, he could save you, a wretched sinner. Because what is he figuring out? He's figuring out that God looks at everybody the same. He doesn't look about if you've got a Jewish background, or you got a Gentile background, or you were raised in the church, or you weren't raised in the church, or you're a Muslim, or you're a Hindu, right? He looks at everybody the same. He's looking for hearts that are seeking him. And that's the difference. So, I think if you do the timeline, Peter's got kind of 4 days over this vision, right? Because he gets a vision, they come, they lodge overnight, says they leave the next day, they don't show up in Caesarea till the day after that. And so all this time, God is working on his heart. So that when he gets there and he sees the centurion bow before him and he stands him up, I think that's the key verse. When he says, stand up, I'm just a man. And therefore you must just be a man. So the cultural prejudice, the man-made tradition, the human fears came crashing down when a man came face to face with Christ. And I think that's what Peter did. And so here's the question. This is why I came without even raising any objection when I was sent for. And so I asked, for what reason do you send me? So verse 29 reflects back to 28 when it says, and yet God has shown me that I should not call any man unholy or unclean. This is why I came without even raising an objection. Because God showed me in the vision. Right? And so then we see the vision, Cornelius' vision in 30 through 33. It says, Cornelius said, 4 days ago at this hour I was praying in my house. During the 9th hour, behold, a man stood before me in shining garments and said, Cornelius, your prayer has been heard, and your alms have been remembered before God. Send therefore to Joppa and invite Simon, who is also called Peter, to come. He is staying at the house of Simon the tanner by the sea. And so I sent to you immediately, and you have been kind enough to come. Now then, we are all present here before God to hear all that you have been commanded by the Lord. So Cornelius explained to Peter about his vision and about his obedience, and these Gentiles wanted to hear the message of salvation from God. And that's what we're going to go into over the next, into the balance of this chapter. And we're going to see what we'll call next week when we go through, it's 34 through 48, I think. Right? And sometimes it's known as the Gentile Pentecost. And you'll see why, because it's going to be exact, it's going to kind of transpire exactly like it did at Pentecost in Jerusalem. So, the Gentiles wanted to hear what God had to say through his servant Peter. They were more interested in the truth, not in Peter. And they got their eyes off the personality of Peter, and they listened to God's message. And so what's the takeaway for us from this? Next week we'll see the Gentile Pentecost. I think the takeaway for us, at least was for me, is, Conrad preached last week, which was devastating to me, about don't look back. Don't look back, right? I reflected on that this week, and unfortunately thought about how often I tend to look back, and that's not good, but it was cool that I heard it, because I was able to confess a lot of that. I was able to kind of get my ship righted, where I didn't even know it was unrighted. I didn't know it was out of whack, right? But I figured it out through that. And I think it's the same thing here. To pray an honest prayer to say, are there traditions? Are there hang-ups? Are there prejudices that I have in my heart? Because if there are, here's the thing. You could go all kinds of traditions, right? You've heard about people leaving churches over choirs versus praise teams. Happens, okay? In other words, what are they hung up on? They're hung up on tradition, right? They're just hang-ups. They're prejudices. So do we harbor prejudices? Do we bring baggage with us? Because listen, everybody when you're saved, you bring all your old stuff that you thought, and you're trying to mix it in with your salvation. That's what 1 Corinthians is all about. He's saying you're mixing your old stuff with the new stuff. You got to get rid of the old stuff. The old stuff is... So are there ways of thinking that you still have today that God wants to... Because, and you say, well, why is it so important for me to give up my hang-ups or my prejudices? Because they kill your growth, and they kill your ability to share Christ. Because what you're doing is you're immediately saying you're prejudging. Prejudice is prejudgment. You're prejudging who you deem worthy of the gospel. And you can't grow when you're still doing that. Peter, I think when I think about what Peter, at 7-8 years of ministry, at what happened, at this point, this is kind of the way I view it, is Peter hit the ceiling for growth. Okay, this is ceiling. What God was saying was, Peter, I can't grow you in maturity. I can't grow you in dependence on me until you bust through this ceiling of prejudice. See what that is? So you say, well, why do I need to address it? Why should I pray and ask God about that? Because maybe it's hindering your ability to share the gospel. Maybe it's hindering your ability to grow closer to Him, more reliant on Him. And clearly, it's purely pride. And go read Proverbs about what God thinks about pride. It's about His number one thing. And it raises His head in so many different ways. So that's where it is. Next week, we'll see the Gentile conversion, or the Gentile Pentecost. And we'll pick up from there. Amen?